ahead and start? See? Okay, and if there's other people, they'll join eventually. Well, thank you both very much for accepting the very short notice and the invitation at very short notice. Just to give you a sense of what this seminar is, it's a permanent seminar that is entitled Governing the Urban. And the idea is, we've been doing this for about a year and a half, to create a space in which we have the opportunity, both as professors and as students, to reflect on issues related to the urban, anything related to the study of the urban. And so Julianne thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to use your visit, because they were here for another workshop that was done last week for a project called Tri-Spaces, in which the project is a very big comparative project that is studying the relationship between public space, transgression, and youth. And so we're taking this opportunity that you're here for that, for you to present what I think is absolutely fascinating work on the city, on mapping issues that sometimes we don't think are mappable. And so it's a great pleasure to have both Dounia and Ahmad here. They come from the American University of Beirut. And they are part, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you both are part of this broader project called Social Justice and the City, which I guess one of the components is what I just mentioned about mapping issues that are very much connected to justice in urban space. So you're very welcome, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's going to be a great pleasure to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much for the invitation. If because of my English you're not getting something I say, you can ask me to repeat something. But I'm not going to be talking so much about the mapping projects that we did. Ahmad's going to be talking about one of them. But today I wanted to, related to the concept note I sent you, that you read, that Mona Fawaz wrote, I wanted to try to have a first reflection and to share with you the way, within this program, Social Justice and the City, we think of ourselves and as activists and researchers, and how the relationship between activism and research plays out in our work in general. So what you read is the concept note that preceded the creation of this program. A little bit of institutional background, because it's important. So this Social Justice and the City program was founded in the American University in Beirut within an institute that's called the Issam Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. When the Department of Urban Planning and Design was approached to with a small grant to create something within the Issam Institute for Public Policy, there was a small reflection that resulted in this concept note as to how do we want to be relating to the idea of public policy. So most of the research programs within this institute, what they do is they think policy. They're policy thinkers. So they do research, they produce policy recommendations through that research, and then they send it to government offices, to officials, etc. And they organize sort of workshops with them. They invite members of the parliament, ministers, etc. to discuss with them these policy recommendations that they have. As you probably read in the concept note, the idea of the Social Justice and the City was slightly different. So the idea was to create a platform where we could think about the policy changes that we want to see, or in general the urban changes that we want to see. And instead of lobbying them or sending them to government offices that will, in Lebanon we say, they will put them in the drawer and they close the drawer and they forget about them. we wanted to create a platform where we can produce these policy recommendations with activists, with people who are active in the civil society, in NGOs, organizations, and then give them that research so that they use it to advocate for what they believe in. So we're thinking we added sort of a third arm to this system of producing policy within the university and sending it to official offices. And I think this is important because we always think about our positions as academics and how we can make our research useful and what is our relationship with activists. And as activists ourselves, I'll tell you a little bit how this plays out in our work. So I decided not to tell you all we've been doing. I'm going to tell you the story of one case we worked on and how it has deployed between activism and research. So this is the story of a resort that's called the Eden Bay Resort that obtained a construction permit about a year and a half ago and that we have been working on. And I took those three roles of the academic that Marcuse uses in his 2009 article that is cited in the concept note, of our role being to expose, propose, and politicize. And you see we do this, but maybe not in that order. So the story starts when we hear that there's a proposed development for the last public sandy beach in Beirut, which is called at the time the Eden Rock Resort. And as you can see, it's pretty nightmarish to think that something like this would grow, like private development would exist on the last public beach of the city. So there is a little bit of background about Beirut. Beirut is situated on the seafront of the Mediterranean, and we say a lot about it that it has turned its back to the sea. So a lot of private development are encroaching on public domain. There's only a small public beach that is remaining, and its inhabitants don't really use the sea in their everyday life. It's really so privatized that we forget sometimes that the sea is there. So this came as the ultimate development that we wanted to refuse. And I wanted to show you this aerial photograph of the seafront. And you can see, so this is the public beach. And you see on the right and on the left two big private developments that exist since the 90s. And this is the last sandy beach that we have. And it's also one of the last places where the seafront is public. So at the extreme left is the plot that we discovered was going to be built by this Eden Bay company.
Where you see some greenery.
Yeah.
Where you see, yeah, right after, on the sand actually. And we knew as researchers who work on the city since a long time that actually the plots next to it are also private, and on the other side the plots are also privatized. So we felt that if this building happens, it will give a precedent for the whole beach to actually be built and privatized. And so when we went on the site of the place, we saw that they had a building permit, an official building permit, whereas normally this place is zoned as non-edificante, so normally no one should be able to build on that land. Plus, this land should technically be public domain, so it's very strange that someone owns it, even starting there. And of course, when we went there, we were welcomed by police and army people who didn't let us enter the site and look at what was happening exactly. So we started doing research about it because the government started saying that the building permit was legal. And this is just, I wanted to show you the type of document that we analyzed in order to build a history of that site and the reasons why it was possible for government to claim that this was legal. So we looked at old aerial photographs, we looked at old maps, laws, text laws, a legal agreement related to property, permits, and a property map. So we did a lot of property analysis actually to retrace that history. And what is interesting here as the relationship between university and activism is that most of these documents were given to us by a small organization working on the defense of public spaces in Beirut, who, because maybe they seemed not too threatening, or I don't know for what reason, the government actually gave them all of these files. And it was the analysis file that allowed the government to give that permit. So it had everything, all the history of the legal transactions that happened in order for this to happen. And this organization is a small advocacy organization. They don't know how to read these documents, and they didn't have the resources. So they brought them to us in the center, and we gathered people from other organizations who work on environmental issues, who work on also public spaces, who do urban research, etc. And we gathered and we were able to produce not only an analysis of how this happened, but also why this should be illegal. And also another note to talk about our position from the university is that through our research, we knew that there was someone called Farid Trad, who was an urbanist in the 50s, who had worked on the development of certain parts of the city. You know, the 60s, it was the kind of development with big roads and where they had this modernist idea of the city, etc. So we knew there was a person who had worked on that in the 50s. And within that time period, we were able to retrace his children, go talk to them, and actually get them to donate the archive to the university, the entire archive. Wow. A part of which was about the seafront, but it was also for us an occasion to get urban archives to the city. And this we wouldn't have been able to do if we were not within such a big institution as the American University of Beirut. So it's kind of how we use the hat that is needed whenever it's needed. So when we went to the urban planners family, we had the university hat that's very official, etc. More than when we started protesting against this project. This is just to show, this is an analysis map that we were using to understand the property, and it was used in newspapers. So it's just to say also that we were able to, through gathering so many groups working on that issue, we were able to start talking about these in the media, to start mainstreaming also certain notions, such as, for example, the fact that in a 1926 law, the earliest 23 law, the earliest instance of talking about public domain and public property in Lebanon, the law says that the public domain is where the wave goes during the winter. So the highest the wave goes at any point of the year is public domain. And this was one of our arguments, because actually the wave was going way further than that plot of land. This is just to show you the type of urban landscape that we're working on. So we have a very packed city, it's very dense, it has really little greenery, and one of the only open spaces that we had until then was that sandy beach, and you can see the buildings starting to be built. So what happened with our research? It took many tracks. First, like I said, it went to the media, and we tried to mainstream it in a way where, or not only mainstream it, but also speak in words that people would understand. Talking about the right to the city and talking about the right to public spaces sometimes is very challenging with the public. So we were looking for ways to talk about these issues in a way where people would understand. and support this our fight against this project. The other track it took is that it was used by one of the NGOs, the non-governmental organization, to actually do a lawsuit against the government who gave the permit. So the lawsuit was in the higher court, and we actually won. So the higher court decided that this permit is illegal. And 1 week later, the same instance decided that actually it's legal after all. So we know that there was an intervention of corruption within that time that made the project legal. But also within that week, I think it was even 5 days, it used to be like this, 2 floors, and all of a sudden it was 11.
Oh my God.
So the developer worked night and day to actually finish the building before it is ruled that it is illegal. But then the ruling was that it was legal because of corruption, we believe. So this was at the time where the lawsuit was going on, and one of the ways we think about lawsuits, so we have organizations working very well, organizations of lawyers working very well in politicizing their work. And one of the ways we work with them is that protests and talking about things publicly actually put issues to the forefront and allow judges to take more reasonable decisions, or decisions that are enlightened by many sides of the story, not just lawsuits that happen in the dark without... So we were able to create outcry that was loud enough that I think this is how the building... Now the building is done, but the outcry that we were able to do led the President of the Republic to ask from the President of the Order of Engineers and Architects, who is a pretty respectable figure in Lebanon. He asked him to produce a study about this area and what happened, why did this building, what was the debate exactly. So our research also helped the President of the Order of Engineers and Architects to produce a report that is very documented about why this project is illegal, which actually was convincing enough for the President of the Republic to ask from the municipality to stop everything on the whole area. So the hotel is already built and we lost on that case, but the government, the local government, used a clause that they can use in the law that's called putting the area under study. It's a sort of moratorium on all permits, all building permits on the area. So our fear that this project would actually allow other projects to exist was at least halted for now. So this is the end of the first phase, let's say, of our work.
Sorry, can you give me just the date to have a sense for when this, like the
so
last...
fall of 2016 was the building phases.
Okay,
And then it calmed down a little bit, I think around last May.
okay,
So a year ago,
right.
approximately, the area was put under study.
Right.
After it was put under study, what we know from the pattern of what happens is when an area is put under study, usually nothing happens for 2 years, and then when the period ends, everything starts again, because the government actually doesn't do a study. So we were inspired by this this urban planning plan that is called the Plan Vert. Plan Vert is a green plan for Beirut that was commissioned in 2013. Yeah, commissioned in 12, published in 13 by through a collaboration between Beirut municipality and Paris municipality, and this urbanist created a plan for the city, for greening the city, through many corridors. It thinks the city in relationship with the sea, with the few urban parks that we have, etc. It's a very, very beautiful plan, and it doesn't take a lot to be executed, except it's in a drawer right now. So the story of this plan was what inspired us for our phase 2. What happened with the Plan Vert is that it was completely absent from all public discourse until 2016. In 2016, there was a municipal elections where a group of planners, architects, civil society people decided to run against the usual party who rules. And one of the main things on their program was the Plan Vert, which pushed it to the surface, and many people heard about it, many people started to want it to exist. Fast forward 2 years later, we have a legislative election soon. And now we see all the politicians use this as a token, so they actually appropriated what everybody has been working on. They were not part of this movement, but they are appropriating it to get elected. They're saying, if I get elected, I will execute the Plan Vert. And today the municipality is also saying that they will execute the Plan Vert. We will see if this happens or not. But this is for us why we think that protest is very important to be pushing our agendas. Protest and political resistance. Because when we do, it brings to the surface our demands, and then they can be maybe appropriated by certain politicians, but then we can renegotiate how they are appropriated, etc. So what we decided to do is to do the plan for the area under study ourselves. And we have been working with architects, landscape architects, urbanists, a big team of people in order to produce first a study of the Beirut seafront, and then produce actually an urban plan that we will go and offer to the municipality. We'll tell them this is how we think it should be executed, and then we will count on our activist partners to start pushing for it and to start reminding people that the seafront is not a forgotten area. What happened a year ago, we don't forget. So this is just a selection of the maps we produce in order to analyze the situation. One of my favorites is the one on the left and lower. It's a map of where the view to the sea is blocked from the street. So it's basically what buildings we should think of removing, or so it's all maps in order to think about what kind of global plan we can think for the seafront. We have all sorts of property maps. We have maps of where it's inaccessible. We have maps of the practices. Where do people swim? Where do people fish? Where do people surf? Where do people jog? All of these practices around the seafront we map in order to be able to produce a plan. This is Ahmad coming into the picture and telling us how to correct the maps. And we start analyzing and thinking through these maps, and then we can produce a more general. So right now, within that project, we're at the phase where the urbanists who are working with us are starting to draw concretely. I think last weekend we had our workshop to decide what are the principles of our intervention. So for example, we're trying to shift the idea of the economy from the idea that big private resorts will create employment. This is a very common discourse from the developers. If I build this resort, I will employ cleaning ladies and servers on the beach and receptionists and stuff like this, to an idea that when a city has an open seafront, it brings a different sort of tourism where people will still stay at hotels and resorts, but they don't have to be on the seafront in order for the city profit from it, from this economic activity. So we do a lot of other things. We work on affordable housing, urban social movement. We always switch between academic papers and more easy to read articles or opinion pieces. We have a building permits database where we're trying to analyze who are the developers, who built the city. We're doing a publication on practicing the city as a refugees, following the influx of Syrian refugees to Beirut. And we organize student workshops, for example, on participatory planning, feminist planning, etc., to introduce the students to different types of urban planning. But I didn't want to talk about all of these because I found it more interesting to get into the details of the mechanisms and the tactics that we choose. And I would love to hear, both of us would love to hear from you how these dynamics play out in urban politics and in governing the city. How long did I speak? Did I take from you?
No,
It's very
fine.
good. No,
It's
not at
fine.
all. No, wonderful.
I think you were actually pretty concise. Well done. Let's switch. Alright, take my coffee and water. Okay, so what Dounia just presented is a case study within the bigger urban social justice in the city program. So what I will do now is kind of go actually back in time to even before social justice in the city, to share with you one project, another kind of case study if you wish, for a project that became a template that is now recreated within social justice in the city. The refugees project that Dounia just mentioned at the end is actually following this particular methodology, this particular template of research. So a little bit of background. Sorry, just a second. Okay. I think this is what I'm supposed to do. Yeah. So I'm also in the American University of Beirut as a faculty member in the Architecture and Design Department. And it's actually a very particular setting. It's a small department that's hosted in the Faculty of Engineering. It's a little bit strange. But what we like about it is that we have a kind of a semi-autonomous presence within that faculty. And it's only 3 programs: architecture, graphic design, and urban planning and policy. So it's a little bit unusual for this very particular combination at this very particular scale to exist. But we always thought that we wanted to turn this situation into something productive, particularly the relationship between graphic design practice. I mean, my interest in mapping is, this is where it comes from, and issues of the city, the urban, particularly on the visualization and representation level. So, way before SJC actually was founded, the director of the program, Muna Fawaz, and myself were interested in kind of coming up with a way that we could collaborate to use design and representation in order to advance these ideas that Dounia right now kind of gave you an example about. So at some point we get invited. It's just a little story that tells you how kind of this method came about. We got invited by the Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam as part of a 5-city program. I think it was Istanbul, Dubai, Beirut, Cairo, and a 5th one. I'm sorry, it escapes me right now. To kind of produce publications on issues of our cities that we would like to talk about, and they wanted a visual component as well. So it was a very interesting opportunity for us to kind of do this thing that we've always been talking about. So what we did is actually decide to produce work on the proliferation of security mechanisms in the city, which you saw us present the other day. And the reason why we decided to do that, because actually there was I think it was 2007 where we got invited to do that. In 2005 there was the assassination of the Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri in Beirut, and it was followed by a number of other assassinations and assassination attempts and car bombs and the like. So this kind of led to an insane proliferation of security mechanisms, of politicians' residencies, private institutions, universities, also obviously governmental buildings and the like. So we figured that it would be an interesting opportunity to produce a study about that uses mapping as a kind of a methodological framework. So we did the work, which I will share with you now very quickly, before I move on to what happened at a later stage. So the work that I'm showing you right now actually has been refined a little bit, definitely from a design point of view, than the one that was presented in Rotterdam originally. But it's pretty much the same set of maps that you're going to see right now. This is what we were talking about in terms of scale, right? The ability to do a kind of a scanning of the city with only a team of 2 people to record every visible security mechanism that actually exists on the street. So this was the result of that work. Let me see, I'll go back to this later. So we managed to actually, it was very much an empirical kind of study, right? So it was really based on observation and experience. We recorded every little thing that we could see, from the personnel, so the army, the policemen, the private security, to the security camera, the barbed wire, and all of that. So this is what we observed, and we also experienced the way that these security mechanisms have been affecting the mobility and the circulation on the streets. So if you wish, I think the legend is a kind of a very important component of this map, because it shows that there's 2 ways in which we're looking at this information. One of it is to record its presence and its location, and the other one is to see exactly how it's affecting the street. So you'll notice quite a complex set of infringements, if you wish. It's not closing streets off or having checkpoints. It's quite a calculated, complex mechanism of operation. So we produced this map, which, as you can see, started telling us a lot of things. The first being that almost every part of the city is affected by this security proliferation. And the second thing that it told us is that obviously there are sort of security hubs that are being created around. Namely what you see up there, which is the reconstructed downtown Beirut, the post-war reconstructed downtown Beirut, a huge reconstruction project that happened since at the beginning of the 90s. You see some heavy presence of security at the tip of the city over there, and interestingly enough, this is where we work. This is the American University of Beirut. So private institutions of the like also are quite gated, are quite closed off. And other things, I won't get into the details, but some of them that are as large as the ones that you see protecting a university are in fact justified by the residence of a single politician. So it can take really extreme. It can have an extreme way of applying itself. But so there's a couple. I mean, we like this map a lot. What was very interesting about it is that people related to it also. They could recognize exactly the elements that they see on the street, and it was important for us to also produce graphically a familiar language in that regard. We didn't want an abstract coding or something that looks difficult to read. It was very important for us to be able to see the barbed wire, to see the tank, and to also devise a language which allows these icons to look a little bit like play pieces. This for us was an expression of the fact that these are often very transient practices, and they can change from day to day. They're not really these kind of like fixed, applied security apparatus. But what we didn't like about it is, a couple of things. First of all, is that it really remains on the level of recording observation and experience, and there's not much analysis in this map. The second is the fact that it almost gives the impression that the experience of this security deployment is affecting everyone in exactly the same way. So the whole reading of positionality was absent, and it was very important for us to reintroduce it in our research. Again, very quickly, we started producing analytical maps based on the original one. So, for example, we noticed, I'll stand up, that these kinds of highlighted areas in white, which you kind of saw very clearly as security hubs, where the security mechanisms were really justified by a site protection. So you have a residence, a university, a mall, a bank, that kind of necessitate this kind of security. But you also have these red lines where we recorded security apparatus that are very heavy, including tanks and army personnel and the like, that didn't really necessitate. I mean, there wasn't really any justification for it in terms of a visible site that is being protected. So what we noticed, in fact, that these lines exist at intersections between areas that host different communities as far as sectarian identities and political affiliation are concerned. So they kind of anticipate riots, and we came up with this logic of the riot control as a reasoning for the security, and we started creating differentiations between the different deployments. What's interesting for us is that Beirut historically has this green line which separated East and West Beirut. It was, Christian, Muslim. This is the general sort of civil war separation. But it's more nuanced than that. East Beirut was predominantly Christian, but West Beirut was actually a very mixed community. But this line doesn't really exist in practice anymore. This particular green line, it exists in popular understanding of the city. We still refer to that part as the East and this part as the West, and this is a remnant from the war. But it's almost like these security mechanisms are creating more green lines, which, didn't really exist, not even in the Civil War. So they become confirmations of the separation of communities, which otherwise might not necessarily be that separated in practice. So that's one analytical thing that we did. Another one was kind of breaking down the security deployment between private security, public security, which is army and police, and mixed. So all of a sudden you start noticing things like the Prime Minister's residence was the son of the one that got assassinated at the time, so deploys private security with the army, with police, and it's a very visible sign of corruption, really. Who's being paid, by whom exactly, and we kind of wanted to question the officialness of this whole practice. So that's another analytical map that we did. And in order to kind of address the issue, am I taking too much time?
No.
Okay. In order to address the issue of the lack of the positionality reading in the map, we decided that it's important to kind of do a more micro reading of the security situation. So instead of looking at the city and where the security mechanisms are present and what they're doing, we wanted to see how different people in the city with different positions or positionalities, create securing networks for themselves in order to navigate this deployment. But to do that, we had to give some background information about Beirut. This is where the whole Rotterdam story comes in. This was being presented in Rotterdam. If this project was being presented in Beirut, I don't really have to tell anybody where's the prime property, and where's the informal settlement, and where's this and where's that. Also, the sectarian or political affiliation distribution is pretty understood by everybody. But for an international audience, it was important to provide this background information. So this is about premium land, former settlement, refugee camps, to show the kind of disparate property value that exists in the city. Another background map was the religious distribution, which unfortunately we did based on indicators of the presences of mosques and churches, which in fact is quite a reductive reading of Beirut, and we're admittedly, I have to say that because it's, one could do a more interesting and nuanced mapping of that, but then the definition of identifying these indicators is going to be much more complex. I can go into that. We came up with some ideas which are quite radical, but unfortunately there's no space for it right now. But this information was important in order to understand what we called the trajectories and practices of the city, taking basically selecting certain people to interview and understand how they navigate the city, and these people have very different positionalities. So we're talking about a male Syrian construction worker, a migrant worker, a female migrant worker who is a domestic worker, a live-in maid, or not necessarily a live-in maid, but that kind of work, these kinds of migrant worker contracts, who could, I don't really remember all the people, but in Lebanon we have a huge presence of female domestic workers from Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, the Philippines. I believe these are the three main countries. So it's these kinds of profiles. And also we did the same exercise for ourselves and published the same trajectories for ourselves as middle upper class academics living in Ras Beirut. And we also included people from different sectarian backgrounds, class backgrounds, gender. We try to cover a set of identity markers in order to show that these really affect the way that you experience the city. Long story short, they showed a very, very different way of experiencing the city. Clearly, one of the findings was that people who are marginal in general or marginalized tended to operate literally on the margins of the city, so they avoided municipal Beirut. You can see it here, for example. This is really municipal Beirut. This area is included, but you can see that it's actually the periphery and the south of the city, the suburban south of the city that's being more used by this particular user. So we noticed, in fact, that all of a sudden these security deployments are not they're not equally applied on everybody. And this is, I believe this is it, yeah. So this was the collection of maps that we did for Rotterdam. We produced a publication in English. Actually, it was produced and designed in Rotterdam. I didn't even go. I don't believe any of us went to Rotterdam to see how this was experienced. It was commissioned just to give the proper credit by a researcher and a scholar called Philip Mizelwitz, who was living in Turkey and working in Turkey at the time. Do you know where Philip is these days?
No, I forgot.
Yeah, I'm not really sure where he is right now, but so he was the person who commissioned these 5 cities and identified a team from each of the cities. And that was supposed to be where the project ends, really. This was its final destination. And then we basically were thinking about that and the fact that we produced this knowledge and disseminated in context where, first of all, it's academic, creative academic in some way, but also really outside the city itself, outside Beirut. So we didn't like that very much, and we felt that the kind of work that we did really merited being shared with our local community. So we decided to republish it in Arabic, disseminated with a daily newspaper for free. We revisited the data in 2009, so we did another survey of the city, we updated the maps. And we also decided to, this was it. This is the university supplement that we produced. And so it's very cheaply produced. It was sponsored by the newspaper that printed it, so it didn't really cost much. This newspaper, which doesn't exist, what exists?
Yes.
It's one of the lasting remaining printed newspapers in the city.
This one doesn't exist.
this, the newspaper that sponsored this particular publication doesn't exist anymore. But again, that's another story about losing print, and I believe it's. I don't know if it's happening here. Is it happening here?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
No,
Okay.
not to that extent, I don't think.
Hopefully you'll be spared. So we also used it as an opportunity to not only invite other scholars or activists or even artists that are concerned with this issue and working with this issue to provide a compendium of ideas. But we also used it to publish our own student work who do reflections on security or whose work has kind of dealt with that issue, including things like graphic designers doing an interventionist type projects in the city to kind of make a commentary on certain things. So this was kind of a more satisfactory final place for this work to land, and it has become a very pivotal methodological template that is being recreated now with different projects. So then we did this one, which is about public space in Beirut. I'm not going to go into the details of the mappings, but it's a very similar kind of process where we identify certain research projects that we want to do. We do them, we map them, we publish them. Sometimes, another thing that we like about this is that sometimes they take on an artistic interest, so they end up in art museums, the cartographic representations, but at the same time it's in the hands of people who can read it. It has academic value, and it has also a kind of a value in the fact that it manages to contribute to popular discourse. So the article that you read, that was sent to you in City and Society, was really the academic article that came out of the security work, which was co-authored by myself, Mona Fawaz and Mona Harab. And what we like is that the starting point of that article is actually this opening, this intro, which begins over here, that isn't very different in essence. I mean, the language might be a little different, the references are less, but this bridging between what is classically an academic output and opinion pieces in newspapers or the like is something that we actually feel very strongly about, to kind of echo Dounia's idea of what is our position as academics and how can we make this work useful. So this was our way of sort of addressing that. And what did I want to say? So yeah, I mean, it became actually a very successful template, if you wish. We recreated it in this guy over here, and now currently we're also involved in a third research project on practicing the city as a refugee that Dounia and I are, we met through this project actually. So yeah, and now it has become a social justice and the city kind of one of the things that social justice and the city does. It began with this kind of interesting design and urban policy collaboration that happened in the department, and now it has it's hosted officially. It's enabled through funding, through different funding opportunities. So that little experiment at the beginning is now really a kind of a repeated series of volumes, and we're hoping to continue doing it over and over again. What was the idea for the fourth one that we came up with the other day? We keep thinking about possibilities. I mean,
Wonderful.
What else after public space, refugees, security? I think it has something to do with food. Perhaps it's because we were eating a lot of really nice things over here and talking a lot about food. We came up with the politics of food and food service. And anyway, so that's our presentation for you today, guys.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. Thank you, Ahmad and Dounia. Marisol, if you want to take well, as much time as you want to.
It's not going to be much. Well, first of all, I want to thank the opportunity of commenting this text because I'm very interested precisely in these questions about the bridges between academia and social transformations and the social impact of social research. And I think it is very common to, as a social scientist, to assume that we care about about social impact of our research, but doing that it's a whole different thing. So, well, what I did, and my commentary goes in two ways. The first one is I did this exercise of looking in these spaces in which here in Mexico City, it's been done this kind of bridges, not necessarily maybe in the shape of a program. So this is the first part of my commentary, and the second part goes around the discourse of the right of the city, and what are the discussions here in terms of bridging academia and social movements. So, well, I start my exercise of looking for these kind of initiatives with the question of what are we doing as scholars to link our research with social transformation processes. So what I found was three main kind of shapes, right? So the first one are the observatories, no? So I started looking because I work in an observatory at UNAM precisely. So the starting point is this: the observatories. I think they can be grouped as pages that present information that is useful for people. In the one I work, it's called Observatory of Territorial Institution. That it was an initiative from the government but also the university, the local government. So first, it was we were trying to do documentation of conflicts in the city specifically. So we take, as you said, like sources, newspapers, maps, legal documents, and then we reconstruct the chronology and we present like the different postures of the different actors that were involved. So we did, for example, the conflict of Supervia, which is like the highway kind of, or like the second floor of it was very polemic. And well, we introduced in other conflicts that were more environmental and they were not precisely here in the city, but we had the material. So, for example, Guadalcázar, we did the reconstruction. And well, that was one first like goal. The second one was to make a chronology of all the legislations towards territorial things. So we did like archive research, and we did like this chronology in different topics. So we took the first one, I think it was about land. So we took the Constitution and like the reforms of the article. So we did this like interactive page where you can see the evolving of the law. And the third thing that was the objective of this was the map, a map to use, but it was more like geographical information systems.
Yeah.
And the thing was to see how how they say los programas de ordenamiento, like the territorial plans were evolved during time also. So we did that with like a few things, with like a few programs, because it was not very cheap to do this because there were like a team of geographers. So that's one like that I wanted to share because this is the one I was involved. And then after that it evolved to a blog because we didn't have much more money to keep the page running, and then we created like a free blog when we keep going the conflicts reconstruction, and we did also like taking legal documents and newspaper to try to tell the story and to put like the resources of how did it go. And afterwards, like over the years, it transformed in like a forum to discuss different topics. For example, when the Constitution of Mexico City came, there was like a very polemic debate about the surplus of the construction. So we invited several like social scientists and experts around it, and they did an opinion, and we posted there. So it was kind of an hybrid. It was weird at the end. And well, one of the problems of the project is precisely that the lack of budget, and there is not like a follow-up. So we have like bits of projects, and I think there is a lack of linkage with social actors, because it was like a very academic thing, and it's there open there for public to see and like to use it as a tool. You can download the layers of the maps, for example, or the laws, etc. But it's not that we actually ask people, like, or for the conflicts we didn't go to the people to ask their opinions. Other examples I found was the water observatory in the UNAM, that they actually link more municipal governments with other actors of civil society, and they tried more to reconstruct the infrastructure, or like how the water infrastructure works in certain states. So it's a tool out there for them to use to actually do something in policy making. I didn't knew like more. I know the page is up there and still going, the project. And here in Colmex I found the Gender and Poverty Observatory, which is more also like a repository of data of socioeconomic aspects, like about poverty in urban areas, but with the gender look. Mm-hmm. So that's like one of the first shapes where academy bridges with policy making and social actors. And yeah, I see the limitations are that it is limited to information and documentation, but they give a voice and they put out there certain topics that are important to discuss, and they also place them on the academic agenda. So the second space I found where these bridges are done are seminars, but seminars like public seminars. So I'm mentioning one that I also worked in, which is it was done in 2015, and it was called Beyond the Right of a City, the Dilemmas and Debates Towards Habitat Earth, like for the UN. Yeah. But it was more like an excuse to discuss about issues that were ongoing on the city. Mm-hmm. So we talk, like there you have academics, you have policy makers, and people that was invited as the general public, and topics were from mega projects, discussions on the right of the city. There was also in that moment like a very polemic thing that was the new airport in the city here in Mexico City, because they're gonna switch like the current airport, the location, to another place, which they tried already, but it was very conflictive and they turned it back, but now it's on again. So it was more like to create a forum where you can hear experts and scholars to talk about these issues, but also when we organized this seminar, we were very conscious about that people is going to be talking about it, like people, activists, were going to go and say something. Mm-hmm. So, and it was like that, and from that the results were not like academic papers, but more like memoirs. So mm-hmm. you can look for them and the videos and everything, and the information's still there, and it's another way to put like, okay, kind of a dialogue between academia, policy making, and...
So I'm sorry, where can you access these
memoirs? Well, I can give you the page. It's a web page.
Oh, so online.
It's online, right, so you can like download the memoirs, and you can even look at the videos. We did also a specific memoir of all the comments of the public. So we did like a systematization of all the commentaries of the people. Okay. And so that is that, but the thing again, the limitation is the time. There's no follow-up, there's not like a monitoring process that impacts public policies. It's just the public dialogue that it's up there, and it stays up there, and hopefully some researchers retake the information. And well, a third one I found, it is more far from academic world, and are like initiatives that come from civil society. So for example, the first one is meetings that people, or encounters that civil society organize. I talk about my experience. There is like the meeting for urban agricultural projects that was about 2016. And it was generated by a civil organization that I work for, and it was called Cultiva-Ciudad. And well, the purpose of this was that there was like a law that was coming out about urban gardening here in Mexico City that proposes like you can take any space you want. So, but nobody knew how to operate that, not even the authorities. So we tried to do this encounter first to recognize each other, to recognize the other projects. We did a map. There was like an app that you could like upload your information and you generate the general map of all these initiatives. And it was a very basic, it was not like an analytical purpose, it was more like a descriptive purpose. And afterwards there was like this meeting between civil society and government, and to talk about the public policy of urban gardening. But again, I think there the interesting part was that academia was not that present. It was present on the public, some people that came, but academia was like outside of the debate. So, but it was also like a first effort. But still, it's there, and the information is still there. The map is still, if you have like the app and everything. And also we did a memoir, and we did a like directory. I don't know, with all the information of all the projects that we mapped at that occasion. And I think a second example of these kind of initiatives are like the encounters that came after the recent earthquake here in Mexico City. Yeah. So there's a few organizations from architects that did meetups to talk about the proposals of reconstruction. So, but it was much more practical. It was much more oriented to concrete propositions, but they also articulate with some movements. So that was the other interesting part. And again, like formal academy there, it was not that present. It was present in the form of people that were experts, but not as institution, like you have this program, no? Like as an institutional effort. So these are like the spaces I found. And well, there was also this initiative of verificados, which was like an effort of civil society to generate information in the moment when the earthquake occurred. But I mean, that was like a very exceptional thing. I think it was like in front of an emergency. But again, in conclusion, well, these are the spaces I found, and these are like the kind of efforts that articulate academy with processes of social transformation. But I think they are disjoint, because I mean they emerge like in a very isolated. No, we have these observatories that have an institutional support, but some of them don't have the follow up, and they don't have like you have a specific theoretical framework. And also I found very interesting, because I look at your page and I saw this, like there was like a page where you upload the projects and you follow up the cycle of the projects, and but not only like the results of the projects, but what are the actions that you did. I have the name here.
On the social justice and the
yes,
city page?
Yeah, well, in the Issam Fars Institute, but I think it was related. So It is the Portal of Social Impact and Scientific Research, targeting research on the Arab world.
That's not. I don't think that's us.
No, it was in the. Well, it was in the.
It could be the Issam Fars Institute initiative, but not social justice and the city per se.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
So we're hosted in a.
Yeah,
it's a small program and a bigger research institute that's part of the I think media studies, public policy.
No, it's alone. It's a standalone.
Right, but they have courses.
Well,
I mean, in public policy. Yeah.
Okay, well,
whatever used to be the PSPA department in AUB, which isn't anymore, I think is turned to that. Anyway, so the relationship between these different things can be quite complex.
Yeah. Okay, no, I thought it was similar, because they had projects of refugees and everything.
Yeah. It's definitely linked. Yeah.
Well, anyway, what I found interesting about that was that they have this follow up of the cycle of a project, but asking questions not only of the effects, but like how much time did you dedicate on doing your research public, or like you have to put it out there. And so I thought that was interesting, and that we don't have that, or at least in the examples I saw. No. Okay, so the second part of my commentary was more about like the perspective on the right of the city. And well, in the paper, in the note you sent us, it said that there were like two approaches to this kind of right of the city. So one was like advocacy, no, and using the right of the city as a legal tool, And the other view was like the politicization of the agenda, no, and the both like a form. Well, I have also to politicize both a form that is especially the city and also to empower, no, certain groups.
Yeah.
And I think this contradiction is also present here, and it's been discussed here. Here in Mexico City, I think there's been discussions about the right of the city from several perspectives. So one is from the population groups like children, indigenous people, urban movements, or from different elements of the city like the cultural heritage buildings and the right of the city, or housing or public space, several perspectives towards that. But there's also been a critique about how to point out this contradiction between putting a political agenda out there and translating it into legal and public policy context. So one of the questions that is being raised here is how to translate an agenda of the right to the city into legal and political framework. So there are discussions about the difficulties that are expressing the collective nature of these kind of rights, the universality, the social planning of the city. You said it before, like in a scale of as huge as this, it's kind of difficult. And also like the execution of that in terms of government. So that's one of the questions that has been discussed here. And the other one is about what happens when the problem of the right of the city ceases to be a political agenda and starts to be a political part of like a legal. Seems like the same question, but it's different, no? Because one is how to, and the second one is it's what happens. And what happens is that when you translate it to like a political agenda, it gets simplified, right, for processes. And so one thing I think it could be interesting to add up to your great research agenda, which I found very, very interesting and very, how do you say, very well done, is to add this up, because you said, no, we have to expose, propose, and politicize, and I will add up to follow up the implementation of this politicization, right? Because there is issues about how to implement public policy in terms of the right of the city. So basically that is my commentaries, and probably I will close up with the story I heard that I think addresses very well this kind of dilemmas. I don't know if you heard about the issues between an activist group called DAM in Palestine. No?
Yes.
So, well, there is this music group that do rap or hip hop, and they did a video about honor crimes, and they were criticized by this academic that it's called Lila Abu Lugot from, I think she's from Columbia University.
Yes,
So there is like a controversial because she criticized like, oh, you're oversimplifying the view of the Palestinian people. But on the other side, this guy says like, well, at least we are here, and at least we're speaking Arab, and at least we're doing something, and you're there, like in your, no? You're writing in English for Western and elitist, no? Audience, and so at the end, what I think that is important about this story is that at the end I think they were concerned both about social transformation, but there was simply not a bridge, and I think it is very important to do this bridge between academy and social activism, and there are several ways. And well, I forgot something, is that I think the results here from research of bridging academy with social transformation are not also formalized in the way of academic papers. All of the things I presented to you are more like memoirs or more like pages that are their information. So I don't know if it could be interesting, or I don't know, maybe it exists, but maybe how to bring all this together, and what is more useful to get to the objective of doing a social transformation. I think that's also interesting to think, and that's it.
Thank you, Marisol.
Marisol. Thank you very much. Gracias, Marisol. you can, if you want to respond, or just open the floor for further questions, discussions.
I'd like to
do,
pick
please.
up on a couple of
Of
things
course,
that were said.
absolutely.
It's quite interesting, actually. Correct me if I'm wrong. Today we happen to be at the Design and Architecture Archive.
Yes.
I don't know if you're aware of the new airport project proposal
Yes. Yes.
that's there. So I think, you're listing all of these kinds of things that respond. Perhaps we can think of designers also as another category of players. They tend to kind of be removed from the formula.
Yes.
I'm not just
Yeah.
advocating
No,
for
yes.
that because I'm a designer, but it's important because a lot of things about the built environment actually end up in their hands.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see whether design and activism exists as a framework. I think these guys who I just met today, and their work touches upon a bunch of things that you mentioned. So a response to the earthquake in terms of proposals of reconstruction, one of them. Two, the protection of cultural heritage. And three, the development in general, like the new airport proposal and how polemic it might be in terms of people's opinion about it. So I had a very brief encounter with the director of the program of the center today, and basically I don't know if you know, but the proposal is the following. So there was a building somewhere. Sorry, I'm not too familiar with the history of Mexico, but that included mosaics that were by far a bigger surface area than the very celebrated one of Urbano, which is, as you all know, a cultural heritage site by UNESCO. So that got destroyed in an earthquake at some point. So their proposal for the new airport is to introduce these structures that are now left in pieces and integrate them in the design of the new airport. If you manage to go and visit that center, they have a beautifully constructed model of their proposal, which shows exactly how they want to integrate these murals. So I don't know, it just got me thinking. I was there today, and it was exactly these ideas of cultural preservation and responsible development and reconstruction that were kind of brought up through this project. And if I understand correctly, the person who I met, whose name I will share with you in a second, Mario Ballesteros, was telling me that their proposal in some way managed to get proposed to the authorities in a similar manner to how the Ramlet al-Baida work ended up with a kind of a report, a study, which is supposed to end up with the authorities that can, and when it's paralleled with advocacy, activism, public discourse, can perhaps make, materialize. I heard from Mario today that the project is being considered to be implemented. So there is an efficacy to whatever it is that they did. It seems to be a success story. So yeah, I think we're missing a piece of the puzzle here.
Yeah. I forgot to mention something that also happened in the encounter of urban agriculture, and it was precisely that a group of architects and designers helped us to do mapping afterwards, like a local mapping of, because one of the things that the law proposes is to identify spaces where you can cultivate things, and then you can go to the government and say, okay, I want to do this piece of land. So what we did with these guys that already have a map, because they have like a kind of a small museum of Tlatelolco, which is like a neighborhood in Mexico City, and they already have the map. So they lend us their work, and they come with us, and we did like these tours around Tlatelolco, and we identify like places, but more like it was more like an activity for people to do. So they identified, oh, okay, here I feel comfortable, and here you have 5 hours of sun, or this is an existing project that we didn't recognize. And at the end, what happened, the result was that they have an exposition of a map of Tlatelolco that they did as a designers in an art exposition, and the final result was an intervention to their map with all these points. So I think, yes, it is important to have also like to considering these other professionals that are not maybe scholars, but they
Yeah, I mean,
some of-
neither scholars nor activists,
Well,
really, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my comment.
No,
Oh,
yeah,
very good.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. I don't know if there are any questions, comments.
Español.
Sí, en español y yo también puedo traducir si quieren.
I feel very glad with the paper, with the proposition, the relation between academic and social work. But I think it's important to notice this ethical relation in academic research, because most of them in academic work, we work with the people and with the real situations of the people, the real with the people. But most of the time, Marisol said, we have not the tradition to return this kind of knowledge with the people. I mean, we publish our academic works or academic papers, and the social problems are in this relation. And in that way, I am very agree with you and with the proposition. But on the other hand, we have I am worried about the relation between right of the city and this academic intentions or academic actions. But on the other hand, the different rights of the city in relation with class inequalities, and on the other hand, this kind of social stratification, because the people with more money think they have more right to the city than the lower people, and in that sense, in that way, how the research or social activists could to try to deal with this kind of different rights of the city. On the other hand, I think the important role of the law, because the state and the market have the law, and the law is kind of the mechanism of the way to decide who has the right of the city, who has the right of the city, and who has not the right of the city. And in this situation, I think the social movements try to bargain or try to resist this use of the law. I think in a Marxist way to know the city or the urban space like economic production, in the case of the bay or of the beach. So I think how the academic, the researchers try to bargain or fight with these inequalities in a structural way, in the right of the law. That's are my two comment questions. And thank you very much.
Do you want to join a few?
Yeah.
Yeah?
And if there are comments or people
Yeah,
want to reply
yeah,
to each other.
Yeah. Can I just say something, or while people are... perdón, no, adelante, no, adelante.
Well, I just have to say that I think this effort in mapping experiences and practices in the city is pretty useful in terms, not only as in a theoretical or academic way, but as you said, in building bridges between academia and social movements. But I was thinking about because you talk about the results of this strategy, but I was thinking about the theory or the method behind it. methodological key or anthropological key in terms of like we already know that interaction between the researcher and the subject of their studies is like a source of information. But I mean, like, people is not only a source of information. The knowledge is built in interaction between them. So mapping experience and practice and urban practices in the city could I don't know how to manifestar
Manifest. So, see?
This interaction. So in a methodological sense and in a theory sense, how to understand that approach. I think this is my big question, a bigger question.
I have one comment and, well, two comments. The first has to do with what you mentioned now and what you mentioned last week about one of the things that you found in this exercise is that a lot of the marginalized communities spatially remained and interacted at the margins of Beirut. And I don't think, I wouldn't say that that's something that we see in Mexico City. And it has to do with, where people work, how long people take to get to, a lot of people live in the periphery and travel 3 hours to sort of the inner city. And I don't know if similar patterns exist in Beirut, where you have, by marginal, I don't know if, I'm assuming it's class-based, and whether there is this sort of drive, the service sector requires a certain population, and which is what you see a lot in the Mexican context in Mexico City. So that's one of the things that I thought was interesting. I don't know if it's an issue of scale or not. And the second has to do with the product. I'm just curious to know if, I guess the question, the formal question is like, what's the literacy rate in Beirut? Yeah. But obviously, doing something like this requires a population that reads this on a daily basis, and it's part of their daily consumption, if you like. I don't know if that's the case, and I wonder if something like this would have the same effect in a place like Mexico City. I don't know. This is sort of an open comment for all of us. But those are the things that I found, among other things, that I found very. That got me thinking. Do you want to answer those 2 points and then we open another round, or do you want? Sisi?
I'm curious about the connection between scholars and political class in Beirut. I mean, usually in Mexico, you can find a former scholar working for the local government or federal government. And this connection sometimes became very important to accept one proposal in terms of public policy. So I wonder, you can find something like that in Beirut or not, because sometimes it's more efficient to have this kind of contact than publish or try to organize the manifestation in the streets to be listened.
Yeah, go ahead if you want.
You want to pick it up?
Yeah, I'll pick a few of them up, and maybe the one about the periphery you know better.
Okay. Sure.
About the relationship of scholars and scholars working in the government, we have all sorts of types of relationships. So the old mayor of Beirut was actually a professor, and not a professor, but he teaches at the university where we work. And it's it's not because someone is a scholar that their politics are good.
Yeah.
So, but it's very interesting because what happened 2 years ago in May 2016 in the elections, the municipal elections, is that many of the people who were running against the usual political class and political parties were actually scholars. And their argument was, we are fed up with proposing, we want to be in power and actually do the change that we have been asking for, or we have been proposing and doing the studies for it, and we have 20 years of experience doing studies and asking, so now it's time for us to be in power. So it's very interesting shift in how scholars and activists started thinking about politics. So yeah, I think there's many types of relationships. There's also some people working in government who are brilliant people working from inside towards the adoption of good plans that later we can say this is a good plan, we need it to be implemented, etc. About the product, in Lebanon there's a very high literacy rate. I think it's 95% or more, I think. I don't know. It's around 95%. So there's a very high literacy rate. I think Ahmad always talks to us, and maybe he could talk more about map literacy, which is not so
Right.
as obvious as words
Yeah.
for people to read.
Yeah.
But we've been experimenting, or we're thinking of experimenting with other types of products. So we're producing a documentary soon. We're trying to think of other formats that also, for example, our lectures are always, the lectures we organize are always filmed. Usually we put the video of an hour and a half online on YouTube and nobody watches it, so we're thinking now of re-editing them so that they're 5 minutes long, so that people circulate them more. So we're thinking of other forms of circulation or products that we can use as from our research. About social class, it's a very big question. We're always thinking of social class and social inequalities for sure in our work. And we know that it's different classes are interested differently in our research. So, for example, public spaces or the idea of a garden is usually appeals more to middle class population of Beirut because they have everything, and what's missing is a pretty garden or a place where they could go for leisure. But when we work on housing, affordable housing, we're working way more with people who are really not affording to stay in Beirut, who are getting evicted, who are whose class power and also you talked about capitalism in the city are affecting way more, and they're clearly being pushed out of the city toward not only the first or the second ring of the city, but even further than that, outside of the city. And this brings a little bit the methodology. So when we, for example, started thinking of a proposal for affordable housing in Beirut, I think here I would suppose you have more of these. In Lebanon, we don't have housing cooperatives. The legal housing cooperatives, the legal framework exists for it, but people don't really use that framework in order to produce housing for themselves. So when we started thinking of publicizing more the idea of housing cooperatives, because we found it was a very good method for people to stay in the city, we did community meetings with people who were being evicted or who were evicted a few years before, in order to discuss together if the framework of a housing cooperative makes sense, for example. So we try, in terms of methodology, also to involve the communities that we are talking about. In the case of Ramlet al-Baida, for example, we really didn't have the time and the resources to involve the users of that space, but it's like the feeling that we should have done this, or like you said, the follow-up, the little things that we don't have the resources to do, we always feel that we should have done it. And as much as possible, we involve the communities in the discussions about what we work on.
What wasn't covered?
No, don't worry. It was just a reflection on the experience of
Yeah,
what you said.
actually-
Marginalized populations remain at the margins spatially as well
yeah,
as the city.
I'll give you a little bit more of detail about
Okay.
that, and perhaps also there's something that might relate to the question of theory and method that might be overarching. It was one example when we say that we noticed that marginalized communities tend to operate at the periphery. But it is a reductive statement, I have to say. It was really just one reading that you can
Right.
extract from these maps. What might be a more nuanced and more accurate representation of that is that this margin, this periphery matters. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're either inside it or outside it. So, for example, a lot of these domestic workers live inside the city.
I see.
But they practice their leisurely activities outside the city. They,
Right.
when on their day off, they go to places that are outside the city.
I
So
see.
it's you know, I mean, some of them who don't dwell with their
Right.
employers start shifting outside as well. And there's a legality that's also related to that. So it's actually quite interesting. So technically, a lot of these domestic workers are not allowed to live on their own. Not really like that by law, but they are on a contract, on a domestic contract, which supposes they inhabit the domicile.
All right.
So in order to kind of avoid that sometimes, they remain on contract with a kind of a personal relationship that they form with a sponsor, and then they can rent and live alone, right? So what happens is that these different communities, and it's quite interesting how this a kind of a multi-ethnic community formation happens through this process, which involves legalities, and I mean it's quite a complex process. But you end up, for example, with Syrian workers, male workers, living in similar neighborhoods as female households with, like Ethiopian women. And it also leads to relationships forming between them. They frequent the same sort of food outlets. They date. So it's quite, it's not a matter of inside outside as much as it is as much as how how relevant somehow this municipal boundary tends to be, and how it is a big part of the spatial negotiation of the city. And I think one word that I would add to what you said is the spatiality of the work. One very guiding framework in our work is to look at things spatially. So I think that is one of the most core theoretical sort of perspective or entry point that we have, that kind of under which all of this can be framed.
Right.
Well, I can go then. Well, okay, I came, but I didn't have access to those papers that I can see that some people have. And I didn't know the topic, but I can find it quite interesting because, well, here, at least in my experience, well, in this college and in the master, where I did my master degree, it is this separate. It's really like Marisol says, no, this joint between this scholar and the activism. So for me, thinking about these two dimensions, it's difficult for me because I think in my experience they are really disjoined. It's different when I am sociologist, so when I study sociology, well, it was different. No? There was a little bit more of this activism. We were really. I can remember from a basin, and I could see the scholars were making, as you said, putting the hat of activism and the hat of a scholar. And in the hat of activism, they have a different legal status. You know, in Mexico, it's difficult. I interviewed an organization that they worked like 2 or 3 organizations at the same time, because they have different hats, so they can practice some legal, some different practices. Legal practices with different hats, and well, in that part it was very interesting. And the first presentation and the second two, I could see that you are making a language, or you are trying to make a language that join scholar and social and to connect with Beirut society. And it's very interesting because you're in that dilemma of what if I write a scholar paper, or if I make this kind of product. And it's I can see that it's really difficult what you are doing, and for example these theme maps, it's to map the experience. So probably Beirut society will be more interesting to see those maps, and with those icons, or that are very easy, even though for another country, that we don't know your language, so we in a fast view we can see what is about it. And another comment. It was very interesting about your security, or what about security maps?
Yes.
Yeah, because Mexico, we have violence.
Yes, we also noticed a very heavy proliferation of police and visible in public space. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, it was very. I did a picture because it was very interesting for me. In Mexico City, there is another work that they map. How do you say, the violence for. No, con mujeres, niñas que son that they are raped.
Yes. Violence against women.
Yeah,
Yes.
violence against women. So it was very interesting for me. Thank you for your comments, Marisol.
Thank you. Actually, thank you a lot for putting it this way. This idea of trying to create a language that operates at the intersections of these worlds. It's and referring to the icons and the language of the map and its accessibility, this whole question of literacy. It's actually a running debate within, this is a little bit of dirty laundry. It's a running debate within our team, our research team, about whether the language of these visual representations should be intentionally made easy, or whether sometimes certain abstractions of information will lead to similar results in terms of people relating to them, understanding them. So it's actually, you put your finger on it. It's actually a question of language, and it's one thing that we hope to reach at some point is, through these different experiments, I would call them, is to kind of solidify a very particular effective language that can actually operate at these intersections. That's great.
Again, I join with the thanks to your work and your presentation. I also want to highlight the the issues you have present on your work, which is the ethical and political commitment you explicitly present with yourself and with your audience in this case, and the common theme here that in Mexico it tends to be a disjoint between academy and social movements. I believe it's caused because of this question, this ethical and political question inside academia tends to be forgotten, and because institutionally Mexican academy is funded by public government, and it imposes a certain criteria of productivity and demands that the researchers are focused on writing papers in determined in magazines,
Journals.
So it demands a lot of time and effort for the researchers, and a work like this, a public divulgation, tends to be like a waste of time because they are compelled to produce constantly. So it's a challenge to remain to bring back these political and ethical questions. And I also want to ask you if this exists in Beirut, if you are facing this type of dilemmas, I believe another issue that tends to play in this joint is that academy, and mainly UNAM is presented as a key player either in public policy or for social movements, and to say that you have the UNAM as a defender of your position is to give it more relevance, give it more power to propose and to politicize your either side. So the UNAM is also faced with this kind of, the UNAM, but also the academy in general, with this prestige or respect is based upon a certain neutrality. So if the UNAM or the Colmex explicitly positions itself as against a public policy, it tends to demerit their position as a key player in the public debate. So I don't know if this is also a tension that exists in your country, and if so, how did you manage to manage it? How did you manage?
I'll take the first, you take the second.
And I have another. On the other hand, this is scholars are compelled to have some neutrality and distance. But on the other hand, the ones that do position themselves as a political commitment, then sometimes there is a risk that they oversimplify the issue or the phenomena as a fight against the good and the bad. So that is also what tends to demerit them in the academic field. So another question for you is, how do you avoid this risk and try to remain politically engaged, but not oversimplifying your subject and your discourse?
Okay. I'll start with that dilemma of academic publishing versus this kind of work. Of course we face this dilemma. It's not. It's actually a big issue. So the reasoning is not just because an institution is publicly funded or not. I think the reasoning is a kind of a certain convention of academic rigor and standards and that exist everywhere. Often these things are related to livelihoods and to job security and things like that, right? So in certain countries we hear a lot of academics complaining about governments giving institutions and academic employees a lot of security so that they don't do academic publishing anymore. I mean, I've heard a lot of scholars complaining about that. You know, you're tenured, you stop working, you know, things like that. In our case, I would say the issue is there. You are at some point for your job security, you need to prove a certain record. And it's like anywhere else, a peer-reviewed article counts much more than something like that, or than even a book, right? I mean, you guys know that probably very well. And we do take a stance against that in a way. I mean, it's not that we don't have any faith in academic in the academic way of working, but or its importance, but we also realize that this needs to be acknowledged. So the way we deal with this dilemma is by there are different tactics that can be done. One of them is to make sure that you start there, you have also an academic text that comes with it, which is kind of like how we dealt with security. The other is, I don't know how it works in all institutions or in this institution, but our work in AUB is really a kind of a three-track work, which is evaluated under teaching, research, and service. And service can, and it's in the narrow sense of the word, can be serving on committees like search committees or university committees or what have you, all sorts of internal operational things, but can also be community service. So our argument is that this, which can be really looked at, it's self-published, it can be really frowned upon. Once you frame it within a community service framework, right? I mean, if you present it as something that is relevant in that sense, then it can make up for that. But it's a continuous struggle, and we have to always make that fight and make that argument. And only very recently in AUB, actually, we managed to to include this definition of service in our evaluation criteria that are adopted by the university. It was a huge fight to actually write it down, and it happened really recently. It's an effort that we're quite proud of, and we're trying to actually move not only our department but to advocate for this kind of work to happen across the different faculties. Baby steps, but I think we're getting there. Excuse me, I really need to go to the little boy's room, so I will leave Dounia.
Well, yeah.
I will leave Dounia to address the other thing. I'll join you in a bit.
The question of the university's reputation and the role and the weight its opinion has, it's a bit of a difficult question for me to answer to, also because I haven't been in the university for very long, maybe a bit less than 2 years. AUB specifically has a lot of weight. So when a professor signs an opinion piece about an issue that's currently being discussed, it has a lot of weight. A lot of people will listen to it, take it seriously, etc. Like you said, happens here. But there are limitations. This is what I'm not sure exactly what they are. There definitely are limitations. I think, for example, professors cannot say that they're part of this or that party, political party. Or it's not formal, but there's a pressure to not be too visibly with a political party, for example. So yeah, in Lebanon too, it's a difficult thing to navigate. We're always navigating.
Is it allowed by university?
Sorry?
Isn't not allowed by the university to take part in a political party, or is it just?
I'm not sure if it's formal or if it's just in general. It's better not to. There are politics that are being played of. Don't be too loud about your affiliation or. For example, now we have elections. The university asked for if we want to host someone who happens to be a candidate, we need to ask for permission before, so that the university doesn't look like it's taking a side in the elections that are happening in beginning of May. So definitely in our position in the university, there are politics that are playing that we need to navigate in terms of how we take a position or how we... Now, if you see in that one, I was checking, the names of the politicians are clearly said, and no one is... I mean, we publish freely about any politician or any phenomenon that we work on. That's for sure. So we have our academic freedom in that sense.
Well, just to keep being faithful with time, it's 7, so if you want to join me in thanking you both, well, Ahmad is not here, but thank you very much. It really was. It's great to have you here. Oh, you came for the applause. Thank you both, and hopefully you'll come back to Mexico. Or we can go to Beirut to visit you even better. Safe travels back. I know you're leaving tomorrow, and thank you again very much.
Thank you for inviting us. It was really a pleasure to come and exchange with you.
No, it was lovely to have you. So thank you for taking the
Thanks a
time.
lot. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. In Mexico, we give.
Oh yes, of course.
Yes. This is for you, Marisol, and for.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, nice to meet you, everybody.
Nice to meet you.